Okay, let's go. Let's do this. Participles. Participles. Are you kidding me? Participles. Yes, participles. Somewhere in the deep recesses of your brain, in some past life, you've talked about participles. What we need to do first is reorient you towards these guys before we go on. First of all, what is a participle? Participle is a verbal adjective. Simple definition. Now, as a verbal adjective, it's going to have a verbal component and it's going to have an adjectival component. So we're going to look over each of these. In English, the participle often ends in ing. This is the present participle. So if you look at the sentence, the flying squirrel is a nutty animal. Just look at the guy, it is. The noun squirrel here is being modified by something. It's being described by another word. By what word? By the word flying. So we ask what kind of squirrel or which squirrel. It's the flying squirrel. Flying is a verbal of some type because you can make it into a verb. You can say the squirrel flies. But in this instance, we've made it into an adjective by putting that ing form on the end so that it now modifies a noun. Likewise, we can have a past participle, and in English, the past participle usually ends in ed. So here we saw a wrecked vehicle in the road. What kind of vehicle? A wrecked vehicle. So you see the participle there acting like an adjective, although it's made out of a verb. So how does the participle function in Greek? On the adjectival side, it can function substantively, meaning that the participle acts like it's a noun of some type or a pronoun in the same way that an adjective can act substantively. And it can also be attributive, as in the previous example, flying squirrel, wrecked vehicle. But on the other side, a participle in Greek can be adverbial. When it's adverbial, it's often temporal or causal, but it can also have other syntactical functions as well. And we're going to look at these in greater detail later. So let's look more closely at the participle's adjectival side. We've said that participles can function attributively or substantively. So let's look again at these examples. The flying squirrel is a nutty animal. This would be an attributive adjective because the participle is attributing some quality to the squirrel, describing the squirrel as an adjective would. Another very common use of the participle you'll see in Greek, though, is the substantival use. And this is harder to do in English. But in Greek, the phrase we have here, the running one, that could all be a participle in Greek. And it would be clear that it's substantival, that it's referring to a person. And that information will be contained in the ending, which will tell you the gender, case, and number as well. So pretend that that makes sense for the moment. And you'll see when we get into the Greek, that should become a little bit more clear to you. So other features of the adjectival participle. As a verbal adjective, a participle can be modified by an adverb. Like adjectives can be modified by an adverb. So here, the example, quickly throwing a nut. Where's our participle? Throwing. It's the present participle with the ing ending. And although it is adjectival in some way, notice that it is also being modified by an adverb, showing you that the participle is also verbal in some way. Adjectival participles have gender, case, and number as well. And the good news here is that you already know these case endings. They're going to be the familiar first, second, and third declension endings that you've been working on for so long. Breathe a sigh of relief. There won't be too much memorization to do here with the participles. But this information is in keeping with the participle's function as an adjective or as a substantive. So like adjectives and nouns, they will have case endings. So look at this example. Edlipsid ton anthropon ton didaskanta tain koinein. He saw the man who was teaching the koine. So I've put in red the noun ton anthropon and the accusative, which means the man. And then I've also underlined the participle tan didaskanta. And of course, you don't recognize that that's a participle yet, but that's what it is. Looking at the endings, particularly of the article tan that goes with the participle, notice that it agrees in gender, case, and number with tan anthropon. So both tan anthropon, the noun, and tan didaskanta, the participle, are accusative masculine singular. And that's how you can tell that they belong together. That one, the participle, is attributive of the other, the noun. And actually, this gives Greek somewhat of an advantage in clarity over English. One of the many reasons why Greek is better than English. Something that happens in English here, falling over, he laughed at her. Now, this is what we call the dangling participle. And if you look carefully, you might be able to tell what the ambiguity is. Who is it that's falling over? Is he falling over while laughing, or laughing as he falls over, or is he laughing at her who has fallen? Now, Greek would make this perfectly clear by the grammatical information contained in the case ending, which is going to tell you the gender, case, and number. So that participle, falling or falling over, would have either a feminine or a masculine ending depending on whether it was modifying he or her. Brilliant! Okay, the participle's verbal side then. On the verbal side, the participle can function adverbially, and this is where we see a participle acting temporally or causally. And again, we're going to look at that in greater detail in subsequent chapter. But here's an English example. Flying, the squirrel munched a nut. So this would be an example of an adverbial participle. Flying, the ing endings, the present participle, munched is the main verb. So you see, what you have to ask is, what's the relationship between the flying and the munching? And most likely you'll come up with a temporal relationship, that the flying is happening while the munching is happening. So in this case, the participle flying would be an adverbial participle functioning temporally because it tells you the time when the munching happened. Another example, throwing a nut, the squirrel chattered loudly. So again, what's the relationship between the throwing and the chattering? And most likely you'd answer that the throwing is happening while the chattering is happening. So throwing here would be an adverbial participle modifying chattering, telling you at what time the chattering happened while throwing a nut. Okay, now because a participle is a verbal adjective, as in English, the Greek participle can also take a direct object. Even though it's technically not a verb, but only a verbal, it can take a direct object, as in the example we just looked at. Throwing a nut, the squirrel chattered loudly. So our participle throwing is taking the object nut. Throwing what? Throwing a nut. As verbals, participles also have tense and voice. Now, it's not going to have all 6 tenses that you learned for the indicative. Another sigh of relief. The participle in Greek will come usually in the present or the aorist or the perfect. Very rarely you'll have one in the future. So really we just need to focus on 3 tenses of the participle. And again, for voice you will have active, middle, and passive. Participles do not have personal endings. Now, why do participles not have personal endings? Well, look at this sentence fragment here, while flying, which I've struck through because it's not really a sentence. While flying, there's a participle in this fragment, but there's no verb in this fragment. And this is the difference between a participle and a verb. A verb is finite, which means it finishes or completes a thought. We do not have a finished thought here because we have only a participle, while flying. This, however, is a complete sentence. While flying, with the participle, the squirrel munched a nut. Munched is a finite verb. And finite verbs will have personal endings that tells you who the subject is. Participles, because they are not finite, will not have personal endings and do not have subjects, so to speak. All right, and finally, the participle can be negated as indicative verbs are, except that while the indicative is negated with u, the participle will be negated with may. But both mean not. All right, so as we go on, we'll be learning how to form the participle. In this chapter, we're just giving you a basic introduction focused on the syntax, how participles function. But what you're going to see is that they're formed as follows: stem plus connecting vowel plus a distinctive participial morpheme, and then the familiar case endings of the first, second, and third declension. So here are the morphemes to look out for. If you see these in the middle of a word right before case endings, a new ta or an usa, that will be followed by third or first declension endings. Or you might see mena in there with second or first declension endings, or omicron ta with third or first declension endings. So those are the four morphemes to look out for: nu ta, usa, mena, and ot. So when parsing participles, because they are verbal adjectives and they have a verbal side and they have an adjectival side, like verbs, they will have tense voice. And in the mood slot, you'll simply write the word participle. And on the adjectival side, it will have gender, case, and number with those case endings. And then you'll indicate as before the lexical form. So it's kind of a combination of the way that you've been parsing indicative verbs and the way you've been parsing nouns. Okay, an exercise. This should be fun because now we're getting into some real Greek. It's some real important Greek too. On page 243, Mounts gives us the Apostles' Creed. And the Apostles' Creed is chock full of participles, so it's great for practicing. The reason I just showed you the participial morphemes a moment ago is so that you'll be able to do this exercise. I want you to identify all of the participles in this. Maybe underline them with a pencil in your book, looking for that nu ta or the usa or the mena or the ot. And then decide what those participles are modifying. Remember, participles are verbal adjectives, so like adjectives, they're modifying a noun or substantive with which they agree in gender, case, and number. Now that you know all the declension endings, you should be able to do this. Match the gender, case, and number on the participles with the gender, case, and number of the noun that they are presumably modifying. See what you can come up with, and we can talk on the discussion board about any questions you might have. Good luck.